Tonight, we're going to talk about 1,000 years of samurai, a story that begins not with armored warriors on horseback or the clash of curved steel beneath cherry blossoms, but with quiet frontiers, restless emperors, and provincial families whose names would one day echo through the corridors of Japanese history. From rebels who defied the court to shoguns who ruled in the emperor's name, the samurai walked a long and winding path across 10 centuries. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of poetry and violence, of retainers who bowed before their lords and warlords who bowed before none. It is also a story of a nation shaped by the sword, yet steadied by ritual, discipline, and an unshakable code of honor. Before we move deeper into the night, allow me this quiet moment. If you find comfort in stories like this one, take a soft second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the journey we share here. And while you're settling in, share your location and the local time in the comments. It's always lovely to know from where and when you're listening tonight. Now, dim the lamps, pull the blanket a little closer, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let us drift slowly into the far reaches of ancient Japan together. The story begins in the 8th century, when the imperial court had only recently established itself at Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility, known to us today as Kyoto. It was the year 794 when Emperor Kanmu, wary of the political influence of powerful Buddhist monasteries in the old capital of Nara, moved his court to a broad basin ringed by gentle mountains and threaded with clear rivers. Heian-kyo was laid out in a careful grid, modeled on the great Tang capital of Chang'an, its avenues wide, its palaces tiled in dark ceramic, its noble quarters filled with the scent of incense and the soft rustle of silk robes. Here in the capital, aristocrats of the Fujiwara, Minamoto, and Taira families would spend their days composing poetry, arranging flowers, and pursuing love affairs recorded in secret diaries. Refinement was the highest virtue. To wield a sword was, in the eyes of the court, almost vulgar. Yet beyond the misted hills of the Yamato heartland, the world was very different. To the north and east, in the wild frontier provinces of what is now Tohoku, the imperial court faced a persistent problem. The Emishi people, indigenous to the northern lands, resisted the expansion of the Yamato state. They were skilled horsemen, adept with the bow, and knew the mountain trails better than any court-appointed general. Repeated campaigns launched from the capital ended in embarrassment. Formal armies of conscripted peasants, poorly trained and poorly fed, could not adapt to the swift raids of the Emishi warriors. And so, out of necessity, the imperial court began to change its approach. Emperor Kanmu turned to a new title, Sei, Taishogun, the great general who subdues the barbarians. The first man to bear this title in a truly meaningful way was Sakanao no Tamuramaro, a general of remarkable skill, who between 794 and 811 led campaigns that finally brought much of the northern frontier under imperial control. Tamuramaro's tactics relied not on massed peasant infantry, but on smaller units of mounted archers, men trained from youth to ride and shoot. These men were not aristocrats of the highest rank. They were provincial warriors, retainers of local landholders, and their expertise on horseback and their willingness to endure the hardships of frontier war would set a precedent. The court began to understand that violence, when needed, was best delegated to those who could master it. From this delegation, quietly and over generations, would grow the seeds of a warrior class. The very word samurai carries within it this origin. It comes from the old Japanese verb saburao, meaning to serve, to attend upon, to wait beside a superior. In its earliest usage, a samurai was simply a servant, an attendant in a noble household. Over time, the term narrowed. It came to refer specifically to those who served with arms, to armed retainers who guarded the estates of aristocrats and stood watch over the fields, roads, and river crossings of the countryside. Only much later would the word samurai come to mean a distinct social class, and later still would it carry the aura of nobility and honor we now attach to it. In these early centuries, a samurai was a working man of the sword, a tool, a servant, a bodyguard. Meanwhile, another slow revolution was reshaping the countryside. The imperial court in Kyoto operated under a legal framework known as the Ritsuryo system. borrowed and adapted from Tang China. In theory, all land belonged to the emperor, and peasants worked it under state supervision, paying taxes in rice, cloth, and labor. In practice, this system began to unravel almost as soon as it was established. Powerful aristocratic families, Buddhist temples, and Shinto shrines began to acquire private estates known as shun. These estates, through legal maneuvering and imperial favor, gained exemptions from taxation and freedom from provincial officials. They became almost independent territories, small worlds within the larger realm. Someone had to manage these estates. Someone had to collect rents from the peasants, protect the harvest from bandits, and settle disputes between neighboring holdings. And so, provincial families rose to prominence. They were not aristocrats of the highest court rank, but they were educated, capable, and above all, willing to fight when necessary. Many claimed descent from cadet branches of the imperial family, disowned princes and their children who had been given surnames like Minamoto or Taira, and sent out into the provinces to make their own way. These families combined the prestige of noble blood with the practical skills of land management and warfare. Over generations, they became the foundation of what we now call the Bushi, the warrior class. Life on these provincial estates was quiet and rhythmic. Rice paddies stretched in stepped terraces across the hills. Farmers labored bent over the flooded fields in spring, planted the young shoots with careful spacing, and gathered the ripe harvest in autumn under the amber sun. Villages huddled beneath thatched roofs. Wooden shrines marked the boundaries between fields and forests. And through this landscape rode the mounted warriors, wearing lacquered leather armor called oroi, carrying long asymmetrical bows made of laminated bamboo and wood. The sword existed too, of course, but in this early period, the bow was the true weapon of the mounted warrior. The samurai of the Heian era were archers first, swordsmen second. Their skill was called Kyuba no Michai, the way of the horse and bow. These warriors trained from childhood. A boy born into a Bushi family would be given a small bow before he could walk. He would ride a pony before he could read. He would learn to string a bow properly, to nock an arrow while galloping, to loose it into a straw target at full speed. He would learn the ancestral tales of his family, the deeds of grandfathers and great-grandfathers, the alliances forged, and the enemies to be remembered. He would learn to endure cold, hunger, and pain without complaint. And he would learn, above all, loyalty. Loyalty to his father, to his lord, to his clan. This loyalty was not yet codified into the formal Bushido we associate with later centuries, but its outlines were already visible, sketched into daily life by custom and expectation. By the middle of the 10th century, these provincial warriors were no longer content to be simple retainers. They had grown in wealth, in numbers, and in ambition. Two great warrior families in particular had risen to prominence, the Minamoto and the Taira. Both descended from imperial cadet branches. Both had been assigned to provincial governorships and had used those positions to build networks of loyal warriors, allied families, and cultivated lands. The Minamoto, sometimes called the Genji, established themselves largely in the eastern provinces, the Kanto plain around what is now Tokyo. The Taira, sometimes called the Hike, built their power base along the inland sea and in the western provinces, controlling trade routes and coastal territories. Their rise was slow, patient, and largely invisible to the perfumed courtiers of Kyoto. The first great warning came in 935. A warrior named Taira no Masakado, a member of the Taira clan, but at odds with his own kinsmen, became embroiled in a family dispute over inheritance in the eastern provinces. What began as a quarrel between cousins grew into open warfare. Masakado, charismatic and fearless, defeated one relative after another. Then, drunk on his own success, and perhaps on ancient dreams of an eastern kingdom, he made an astonishing move. In 939, he declared himself the new emperor, the Shinno, of a rival court in the east. He seized the offices of 8 provinces, drove out the imperial governors, and proclaimed a new imperial line. The court in Kyoto was thrown into panic. This was not merely a rebellion. This was an unmasking of an uncomfortable truth. The court no longer controlled its own frontiers. The warriors had grown stronger than the emperor's own guards. The rebellion of Taira no Masakado was crushed within a few months. Ironically, it was other provincial warriors, distant relatives of Masakado himself, who tracked him down and killed him in early 940. An arrow, it is said, struck him in the forehead as he rode into battle. His head was sent to Kyoto, where it was displayed as a warning. And yet, the warning ran in both directions. The court had been forced to rely on warriors to defeat a warrior. The imperial system had shown its weakness, and the samurai had shown their strength. From that moment forward, though the courtiers still composed poetry beneath the cherry blossoms and still spoke of the warriors as rough men of the countryside, the balance of real power had begun, quietly and irreversibly, to shift. At the close of this first chapter, we stand in a Japan poised between two worlds. In Kyoto, the aristocrats compose their 31-syllable poems, exchange letters written on scented paper, and gaze at the autumn moon through gauze curtains. In the provinces, warrior families ride their small, tough horses through cedar forests, practice archery at dawn, and quietly build the networks that will one day carry them to power. The samurai have not yet ruled. They are still, in name at least, servants. But the century to come will bring wars that will shatter the old order forever, and from the ruins will rise a new age. An age of shoguns, of civil wars, of loyalty tested by fire, and of a warrior code carved slowly into the soul of a nation. The centuries that followed the rebellion of Taira no Masakado passed slowly, like the drifting of mist through mountain valleys. On the surface, the imperial court in Kyoto continued its refined existence. Emperors ascended and abdicated, sometimes reigning as adults, sometimes as children guided by regents. The Fujiwara family, masters of political marriage and quiet influence, had by the 10th and 11th centuries reached the summit of court power. Through the careful placement of daughters as consorts to successive emperors, the Fujiwara had made themselves grandfathers to sovereigns and uncles to princes. They ruled not through open decree, but through whispered advice, through arranged marriages, through the delicate machinery of a court that valued elegance above authority. At their height, under the great regent Fujiwara no Michinaga in the early 11th century, the family seemed untouchable. Michinaga famously composed a poem comparing his own life to the full moon, complete and without lack. Yet even as he wrote those lines around the year 1018, the tides were already turning beneath his feet. For while the Fujiwara occupied themselves with court ceremony, the provincial warriors continued their patient ascent. Every generation, more land fell into the hands of the Shun estates. Every generation, the warrior families of Minamoto and Taira expanded their networks of retainers, alliances, and marriage ties. Every generation, the imperial court became more dependent on these provincial swords to keep the peace, to suppress banditry, to collect taxes from unwilling peasants, to escort tax convoys along dangerous roads. The court paid the warriors with land grants, with offices, with titles. Each payment strengthened the warriors and weakened the court. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted. In the countryside, the daily life of these warrior families settled into its own quiet rhythms. A samurai household in the 11th century was often built around a fortified compound, a manor house of dark timber surrounded by a moat and earthen ramparts. Within the compound stood the main hall where the head of the family conducted business, received retainers, and dined with his sons. Nearby stood the storehouses filled with rice, dried fish, and lacquerware. Stables sheltered the horses. A shrine to the family's guardian kami stood beneath ancient trees, its wooden pillars weathered by rain and time. Beyond the walls stretched the rice paddies, the mulberry orchards for silkworm cultivation, and the cedar forests where the men of the household hunted deer and wild boar in the cold months. The children of these households grew up surrounded by both refinement and hardship. They learned to read and write, at least in the phonetic Kana script, and often studied Chinese classics under family tutor. They memorized poems from imperial anthologies. But they also learned to draw a bow at dawn in the frost, to endure the sting of a wooden training sword, to sleep on hard tatami with only a wooden pillow. Girls learned needlework and calligraphy, but also learned to defend the household in the absence of men. Warrior wives were often formidable managers of estates, capable of overseeing harvests, disciplining servants, and when necessary, directing defenses during raids. A samurai family was, in its essence, a military unit dressed in the robes of a landholding household. By the late 11th century, a new shift emerged that would further loosen the Fujiwara grip on power. Emperor Go-Sanjo, who ascended in 1068, was the first emperor in many decades who was not born of a Fujiwara mother. He came to the throne determined to reassert imperial authority. He conducted audits of the Shun estates, cancelled illegal exemptions, and worked to bring the court's finances back under central control. His son, Emperor Shirakawa, took this policy of imperial reassertion further still. After abdicating the throne in 1087, Shirakawa did not retire quietly into a life of religious meditation, as tradition might have suggested. Instead, he moved into a separate palace and continued to rule from behind the scenes, giving orders to the reigning emperor, who was his young son. This system, called Insei, or cloistered rule, allowed retired emperors to bypass the Fujiwara regents entirely and to govern directly through their own household administration. Insei changed the political calculations of the age. Retired emperors, freed from the ceremonial constraints of the throne, could act with greater freedom. They accumulated their own estates, cultivated their own retainers, and importantly, formed direct relationships with warrior families. Shirakawa, and after him his grandson Toba, and after him Toba's sons, all turned increasingly to the Minamoto and the Taira as instruments of their will. Warrior leaders were summoned to the capital to serve as palace guards, to lead punitive expeditions against troublesome monasteries, to enforce imperial decrees against recalcitrant governors. Each summons brought the warriors closer to the center of power. Each mission bound them more tightly to the personal ambitions of retired emperors and their factions. The great warrior monasteries themselves had become a problem the court could not ignore. In the hills around Kyoto and Nara, vast Buddhist temple complexes had grown wealthy on their own estates and had raised their own armies of warrior monks, the So. These men, shaven-headed and wrapped in dark robes over their armor, wielded long naginata polearms and were feared throughout the capital. When a temple felt slighted by an imperial decision, its monks would descend from the mountains, carrying the sacred palanquin of their guardian deity, marching into Kyoto to demand redress. To attack these sacred processions was to risk divine punishment, and yet to yield to them was to erode the authority of the throne. Only the samurai, with their bows and their willingness to shed blood without regard for taboo, could keep the Sohei in check. Once again, the warriors were called upon to do what the court could not do itself. By the middle of the 12th century, tensions within the imperial family itself had reached a breaking point. Emperor Toba had two sons, and the question of succession pitted father against son and brother against brother. In 1156, this simmering conflict erupted into open violence. The dispute, known to history as the Hojin Rebellion, was fought not in the wilderness of the provinces, but in the very streets of Kyoto itself. The imperial factions each summoned their warrior allies. The Taira, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, and the Minamoto, under Minamoto no Yoshitomo, fought on the side of Emperor Go-Shirakawa. Against them stood other members of the same families, allied with the rival claimant, the retired Emperor Sutoku. Uncles fought nephews, brothers fought brothers, and cousins hunted each other through the burning streets of the capital. The Hojin Rebellion was brief, lasting only a matter of days, but its consequences were profound. For the first time in living memory, warriors had fought openly within the sacred precincts of the capital. Nobles who had once dismissed the samurai as coarse provincials now realized that these men held the ultimate power of decision. Whoever commanded the loyalty of the greatest warriors would command the imperial court itself. The victorious side, that of Emperor Go-Shirakawa, prevailed only because Kiyomori and Yoshitomo had brought their retainers to its aid. The defeated members of the imperial family and the Fujiwara were executed or exiled. The old prohibition against executing court nobles, unbroken for over 3 centuries, was shattered in a single afternoon. The gentleness of the Heian world was gone, and it would not return. Only 3 years later, in 1159, the uneasy alliance between Taira and Minamoto collapsed. Minamoto no Yoshitomo, feeling slighted by the rewards he had received compared with those of Kiyomori, joined a court faction plotting to seize power while Kiyomori was away on pilgrimage. This conflict, called the Heiji Rebellion, unfolded again in the streets of Kyoto. For a brief moment, the Minamoto seemed to hold the capital, but Kiyomori returned with astonishing speed, rallied his forces, and crushed the rebellion. Yoshitomo fled eastward through the snowy mountains, seeking refuge among old allies in the Kanto. He was betrayed by a supposed friend and killed in a bathhouse, cut down while unarmed and defenseless. His severed head was carried to Kyoto and displayed by his enemies. The Heiji Rebellion left the Taira family, and Kiyomori in particular, in a position of unprecedented power. Kiyomori did not simply return to his provincial estates once the fighting ended. He remained in Kyoto, took up residence in a great mansion, and gradually integrated himself into the very heart of the court. He arranged marriages between his daughters and members of the imperial family. He accepted high court offices previously reserved for the Fujiwara. By 1167, he had risen to the position of Daijo Daijin, Chancellor of the realm, the highest civilian office in the empire. A provincial warrior, descended from an imperial cadet branch to be sure, but nonetheless a man of the sword, now sat at the summit of the aristocratic order. It was a moment without precedent in Japanese history. Kiyomori's rise was not without opposition. Many at the court resented the presence of a warrior in their midst. They mocked the Taira retainers for their rough manners, their unrefined speech, their inability to compose proper poetry. Behind sliding doors, aristocrats whispered that the age had come to a shameful pass. Kiyomori, for his part, responded not with humility, but with growing arrogance. He replaced court officials with his own kinsmen. He installed his infant grandson on the imperial throne. He extended his power over the coastal provinces, monopolized trade with Song China, and grew fabulously wealthy from the flow of Chinese porcelain, silk, and coinage. The Taira, once provincial warriors, now dressed in silk brocades and rode in gilded ox carts through the streets of the capital. They had, in a sense, become the very thing they had once served, and in that transformation they had planted the seeds of their own destruction. For while the Taira grew rich and comfortable in Kyoto, the surviving Minamoto scattered across the provinces nursed their grievances. Yoshitomo's young sons had been spared execution after the Heiji Rebellion, sent instead into exile at temples and monasteries. One of these sons, a boy named Yoritomo, was banished to the eastern province of Izu. He was raised there in modest circumstances, watched over by warrior families who had once served his father. He grew from a boy into a serious, watchful young man. He said little, revealed less, and studied the world around him with careful patience. Another son, called Yoshitsune, was sent to a mountain temple and grew into a slight, agile youth said to have been trained in swordsmanship by mountain spirits. These sons of the defeated Minamoto were in the eyes of Kiyomori mere ghosts of a broken family. They were forgotten inconveniences, not threats. It was a grave miscalculation. At the close of this second chapter, the stage is set for a war that will burn across the entire archipelago. The Taira sit at the summit of court and country, seemingly untouchable, their scarlet banners flying above the palaces of Kyoto. The Minamoto, scattered and diminished, wait in the eastern shadows, their white banners folded but not forgotten. The imperial family, divided against itself, watches uncertainly as the balance of power slips fully from its hands into those of the warriors. And in temples and provincial manors across the land, retainers sharpen their arrows, oil their armor, and speak in low voices of grievances long remembered. The dry grass of civil war awaits only a spark. In the next chapter, that spark will come, and from the flames will rise the first true samurai government in the history of Japan. Spark that ignited the Great War came not from a battlefield, but from a whispered plot within the walls of a mountain temple. By the late 1170s, the resentment against Taira no Kiyomori had grown so widespread that even the imperial family itself began to conspire against him. In 1177, a group of courtiers and warrior monks gathered secretly at a place called Shishigatani in the wooded hills above Kyoto to plan the overthrow of the Taira. The plot was betrayed. Kiyomori, always vigilant, moved swiftly. The conspirators were arrested, tortured, exiled, or executed. Some were tossed into the sea. Others were left to starve in remote provinces. The retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, suspected of complicity, was placed under virtual house arrest. Kiyomori's grip on power tightened, but so too did the hatred simmering against him. The Taira had become not merely dominant, they had become tyrannical. And a tyrant, however powerful, walks a narrow path indeed. In 1180, the crisis came to its head. Kiyomori, determined to secure the succession for his own bloodline, forced the abdication of the reigning emperor and placed his infant grandson, Antoku, upon the throne. This child, barely 2 years old, was the son of Kiyomori's daughter, and thus Kiyomori himself became grandfather to the emperor. It was the ultimate consolidation of Taira power. But it was also an act of extraordinary arrogance. Another imperial prince, Mochihito, felt himself cheated of the throne. In the spring of that year, he issued a secret call to arms, a document known as the Prince Mochihito's Edict, urging all Minamoto warriors and their allies across the provinces to rise against the Taira. Copies of this edict were carried by trusted messengers along the mountain roads, into remote valleys, and across the sea to distant islands. In every province where a Minamoto retainer still lived, in every temple where the Taira were resented, the message was received and read aloud in whispered councils. The prince's rebellion itself was short-lived. Mochihito and his warrior monk allies were hunted down and killed at the Battle of Uji, on the banks of a river south of Kyoto, in the summer of 1180. Yet the edict had already done its work. Far to the east, in the province of Izu, the young man Minamoto no Yoritomo received his copy. He was now in his early 30s, having spent 20 years in quiet exile, watching, waiting, marrying into the powerful Hojo family of local warriors. He read the edict, considered it in silence for many days, consulted with his father-in-law Hojo Tokumasa, and then made his decision. He would raise the banner of his family. He would call upon the eastern warriors who had once served his father Yoshitomo. He would challenge the Taira in open war. At first, the rebellion went badly. Yoritomo's initial uprising in the 8th month of 1180 was crushed at the Battle of Ishibashiyama. His small force, gathered hastily from the warriors of Izu and neighboring provinces, was outnumbered and outmatched. Yoritomo himself narrowly escaped death, hiding in the hollow of a great tree while Taira retainers searched the mountain passes around him. There is a legend that a pair of doves flew from the hollow as his pursuers approached, and the searchers, believing no man could hide there without disturbing the birds, moved on. Yoritomo emerged from that hollow into the safety of the eastern forests, and from there began, slowly, patiently, to rebuild his forces. He gathered around him the great warrior families of the Kanto Plain, the Miura, the Chiba, the Hatekyama, the Kajiwara. Each family brought its own retainers, its own horses, its own storehouses of arrows and armor. Within months, Yoritomo commanded an army of tens of thousands. Meanwhile, other Minamoto rose across the archipelago. In the mountains of central Japan, a wild and charismatic warrior named Minamoto no Yoshinaka, called Kaizo Yoshinaka for the valley where he had grown up, raised his own force. Yoshinaka was Yoritomo's cousin, but the two men were nothing alike. Yoshinaka was impetuous, fierce, and brilliant on horseback. He had grown up in the deep mountains, hardened by cold winters and mountain hunting, and his warriors were tough men from provinces where the Taira had never held real authority. In the north, other Minamoto allies raised their banners. Across the western provinces, temples that had been slighted by the Taira offered their Sohei, their warrior monks, to the cause. What had begun as a scattered handful of rebellions became, within 2 years, a general war across the entire realm. The war that unfolded between 1180 and 1185 is known to Japanese history as the Genpei War. The name comes from the Chinese readings of the two clan names, Gen for Minamoto and Pei for Taira. It was a war unlike any that had come before it. Where earlier conflicts had been decided in the streets of Kyoto in a matter of days, this war spread across mountains, plains, and seas. Armies moved along ancient roads and river valleys. Fleets clashed in coastal waters. Temples burned. Provinces changed hands. Ordinary peasants, caught in the middle, fled their villages or found themselves conscripted to carry supplies, dig fortifications, or ferry warriors across rivers. The rhythms of provincial life, so long stable, were disrupted by the constant passage of armies. In 1181, in the midst of this widening conflict, Taira no Kiyomori died. He was old, and it is said that his final illness was so intense that his body burned with fever until water splashed upon him hissed and turned to steam. He died raging, it is told, demanding that his final request be honored, that the head of Yoritomo be brought before his tomb. The head was never delivered. His sons and grandsons inherited his power, but not his political skill. Without Kiyomori's iron hand, the Taira leadership grew uncertain, divided, and reactive. They responded to Minamoto victories, but no longer set the terms of the war. The initiative had passed to the east. By 1183, Kaiser Yoshinaka had marched westward and captured Kyoto itself. The Taira, unable to defend the capital, fled in haste. They took with them the child Emperor Antoku and the three sacred treasures of the imperial regalia, the sword, the mirror, and the jewel, which together symbolized the legitimacy of the throne. They retreated to their strongholds along the inland sea, gathering their fleets and their remaining retainers around them. For a brief moment, Kaiser Yoshinaka held Kyoto and seemed poised to become the master of the realm. But Yoshinaka was a warrior of the mountains, not a politician of the court. His retainers, unfamiliar with the customs of the capital, offended courtiers and looted the estates of nobles. Retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, ever the survivor, quickly turned against him and secretly sent messages to Yoritomo in the east, urging him to send forces to remove Yoshinaka from the capital. Yoritomo dispatched two of his younger brothers to deal with Yoshinaka. The first was Minamoto no Noriyori, steady and dependable. The second was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the brother who had been raised in a temple and trained, according to legend, by mountain spirits. Yoshitsune was small in stature, but astonishingly agile, brilliant in tactics, and possessed of an almost reckless personal courage. In the first month of 1184, the brothers led an army into central Japan and defeated Yoshinaka at the Battle of Owazu. Yoshinaka fought bravely, but his forces were cornered on the shore of Lake Biwa. As he attempted to flee across the frozen fields, his horse became mired in a rice paddy hidden beneath the ice. An arrow struck him through the neck, and he fell into the mud. His companion, a woman warrior named Tomo Gozen, is said to have fought at his side to the end, wielding a naginata and cutting down attackers, before finally slipping away into legend. With Yoshinaka eliminated, the full weight of Minamoto force turned upon the Taira. Yoshitsune now emerged as the great tactical genius of the war. In the third month of 1184, at the Battle of Ikai-no-Tani, he led a small force of horsemen down an almost vertical mountain slope behind the Taira encampment. His warriors descended cliffs so steep that the Taira had thought them impassable and burst upon the enemy from a direction no defender had prepared for. The Taira lines collapsed in panic. Many warriors fought and died bravely, but many others fled to their ships and escaped westward along the coast. It was among the dead of Ikai-no-Tani that the tale of Atsumori would be born, a young Taira noble of 16 killed by a veteran Minamoto warrior named Kumagai. Atsumori's youth, his flute wrapped in silk at his sash, his refusal to name himself before dying, became for later generations the perfect image of the tragic beauty of a doomed warrior. The Taira retreated to the island of Shikoku and to the fortress of Yashima along the coast of the inland sea. In the second month of 1185, Yoshitsune again outmaneuvered them. He crossed a stormy sea with only a handful of ships, landed at a beach the Taira had left undefended, and rode up behind their encampment. Once again, panic overtook the defenders. Once again, the Taira fled to their ships. It was during this retreat that one of the most famous images of the entire war took form. A Taira ship displayed a fan atop its mast, painted with the red disk of the sun, and challenged any Minamoto archer to strike it from horseback across the waves. A young warrior named Nasu no Yoichi accepted the challenge. He rode his horse into the surf, drew his great bow, prayed briefly to the gods of his homeland, and loosed a single arrow. The arrow flew across the wind and the water and struck the fan clean from its pole. Warriors on both sides, it is said, roared their approval, and for a moment enemies remembered that they were also fellow warriors sharing a moment of grace. The end came at Dan no Yura in the third month of 1185. The Taira, cornered against the western tip of Honshu at the narrow strait between Honshu and Kyushu, gathered their entire remaining fleet for a final battle. Hundreds of ships filled the strait, painted with red banners for the Taira and white banners for the Minamoto. The battle began well for the Taira, whose sailors knew the tidal currents of the strait better than their enemies. But as the day wore on, the tide reversed. Yoshitsune's forces began to gain the upper hand. Minamoto arrows rained down upon the Taira decks. Taira warriors leapt into the sea rather than face capture. And thereupon her grandmother's ship, the Emperor Antoku, only 7 years old, watched the destruction of his family. His grandmother, the widow of Kiyomori, took the child in her arms. She spoke to him softly, telling him that beneath the waves lay a capital more beautiful than any on land. Then she stepped from the deck into the sea, carrying the young emperor with her, and both were lost beneath the waves. The sword of the imperial regalia, one of the 3 sacred treasures, went down with them, never to be recovered. At the close of this third chapter, the Genpei War is over. The Taira have been utterly destroyed, their banners burned, their leaders drowned or beheaded. The Minamoto banners, once folded in exile, now fly from every province. And in the eastern town of Kamakura, far from the perfumed halls of Kyoto, Yoritomo has been quietly building something new. Not a court, not a regency, something the archipelago has never seen before. A government of warriors by warriors for warriors. The age of the samurai as servants is over. The age of the samurai as rulers is about to begin. With the destruction of the Taira at Dan no Yura, all eyes turned eastward, toward the small coastal town of Kamakura. It lay along the shore of a shallow bay, ringed by wooded hills on 3 sides and open to the sea on the 4th. Before the war, Kamakura had been little more than a fishing village with a modest shrine dedicated to Hachiman, the god of war and the patron deity of the Minamoto clan. Yoritomo had chosen it as his base of operations for practical reasons. The surrounding hills made it easy to defend. The narrow approaches could be closed with fortifications, and the site lay in the heart of the Kanto Plain, surrounded by the loyal warrior families who formed the backbone of his army. But by 1185, Kamakura was no longer a village. It was becoming the seat of a new kind of power. While Yoshitsune had won the battles at sea and in the mountains, it was Yoritomo who had won the war of organization. Throughout the 6 years of conflict, he had remained in the east, rarely riding out to command in person. Instead, he had built a machinery of government from the ground up. He had established the Samurai Dokoro, the board of retainers, to organize and reward the warriors who served him. He had created the Kumonjo, the public documents office, to handle correspondence, land grants, and official decrees. He had appointed a Monchujo, an inquiry office, to hear disputes and administer justice. These were not the offices of an imperial court. They were the offices of a warrior government, staffed by warriors and their scribes, operating in the language of the sword and the soil rather than the language of poetry and ceremony. In 1185, even as the Taira ships still burned in the Western Strait, Yoritomo pressed the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa for a remarkable concession. He requested and received the right to appoint 2 categories of officials throughout the provinces. The first were the Shugo military governors, who would oversee the warriors of each province and enforce order. The second were the Jito, land stewards, who would be attached to individual estates to collect a portion of the rice tax and administer justice on behalf of the Kamakura government. This dual system of Shugo and Jito was a masterstroke. It allowed Yoritomo's authority to reach into every corner of the archipelago, into every provincial capital and every private estate, without directly displacing the imperial court or the aristocratic landholders. In theory, the emperor still reigned. In theory, the great families still owned their shun. But in practice, the warriors placed by Yoritomo now controlled the flow of rice, the enforcement of judgments, and the loyalty of local retainers. It was a quiet revolution wrapped in the robes of continuity. Yet even as Yoritomo consolidated his authority in the east, a shadow fell across his relationship with the brother who had won his war. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the brilliant tactician of Ike no Tani and Yashima and Dan no Yura, had never been entrusted with political responsibilities. He was a warrior, and his gifts were the gifts of the battlefield. When the war ended, Yoshitsune returned to Kyoto, expecting recognition and reward. Instead, he found himself surrounded by suspicion. Retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, ever the manipulator, had granted Yoshitsune court titles without first consulting Yoritomo. To Yoritomo, this was a grave breach. The court was attempting to divide the Minamoto brothers, to elevate the younger against the elder, to prevent the consolidation of warrior power in a single family. And Yoshitsune, whether from naivety or from pride, had accepted the titles. Yoritomo's response was cold and unwavering. He refused to allow Yoshitsune to return to Kamakura. Messengers passed back and forth between the brothers, but the breach only widened. By late 1185, Yoritomo had determined that his brother must be eliminated. He dispatched retainers to hunt him down. Yoshitsune, realizing the danger, gathered a small band of loyal followers and fled north, seeking refuge with the Fujiwara clan of Oshu, the great northern warrior family that had built its own quasi-independent realm around the city of Hireizumi. For 4 years, Yoshitsune lived under their protection. He became a fugitive prince, sheltered in the northern forests, moving between mountain temples and remote manors. Legends grew around him even during his lifetime. Tales of narrow escapes, of impossible leaps across mountain gorges, of loyal retainers who died to shield his passing. The most famous of these retainers was Musashibo Benkei, a giant of a warrior monk who had once challenged Yoshitsune on a bridge in Kyoto and been defeated in single combat. Benkei had sworn undying loyalty to the young Minamoto lord from that moment forward, and he followed him into exile, into flight, into the final darkness. In 1189, the northern Fujiwara, pressed by threats and promises from Kamakura, finally turned upon Yoshitsune. Their forces surrounded the residence at Koromagawa, where he had taken shelter. As the attackers closed in, Benkei is said to have stood alone in the outer gate, defending the entrance against a rain of arrows. He fought on even as arrow after arrow struck him, until at last, still standing upright with his naginata gripped in both hands, he died. His body remained on its feet, a wall of muscle and iron blocking the door, and it was some time before the attackers dared to approach and confirm that he was truly dead. Within the house, Yoshitsune had already made his end. He killed his wife and his infant daughter, then turned his sword upon himself, choosing death rather than capture. He was 30 years old. The death of Yoshitsune closed a chapter, but it also opened a wound in the memory of the age. For centuries afterward, Japanese poets, playwrights, and storytellers would return to the tale of the brilliant brother destroyed by the cold calculations of the elder. Yoritomo would be remembered as the founder of a great order, but also as the man who could not spare his own blood. Yoshitsune would be remembered as the tragic hero, the warrior too pure for the world of politics, cut down by the very family for which he had won everything. His story became one of the great archetypes of Japanese narrative, the doomed and beautiful loyal servant, betrayed by the world he had served. With Yoshitsune dead, and the northern Fujiwara subsequently annihilated by Yoritomo's forces in the same year, no rival remained. In 1192, Yoritomo received from the imperial court the title he had long sought, Sei Taishogun, the great general who subdues the barbarians. It was the same title that Sakanao no Tamuramaro had held nearly 4 centuries earlier, granted for the Emishi campaigns of the north. But in Yoritomo's hands, the title took on a new meaning. It was no longer a temporary military commission. It became a permanent office, hereditary and continuing, held by a warrior who ruled the realm even as the emperor sat upon the throne. From this moment onward, the word shogun would carry the weight of true governance. The formal seat of authority remained in Kyoto. The actual seat of power lay in Kamakura. This dual structure, imperial court and warrior government, would define Japan for the next 700 years. The Kamakura shogunate, as it came to be called, developed a distinctive character. It was not a lavish court. Yoritomo forbade his retainers from adopting the perfumed manners of Kyoto. He required them to live in modest wooden mansions, to train constantly at arms, to keep their retainers under strict discipline. The city of Kamakura itself grew, but grew as a warrior town rather than as an imperial capital. Streets of samurai residences fanned out from the great shrine of Hachiman. Training grounds were laid out for horseback archery, for Yabusame competitions in which mounted warriors shot 3 targets in rapid succession while galloping down a long, straight course. The shrine of Hachiman was expanded and beautified, its wooden halls painted in reds and greens, its avenues lined with cherry trees. The great bronze statue of Amida Buddha, sitting in serene meditation, would come later in the following century, but the spirit of the town was already forming. It was a place of prayer and discipline, of loyalty and vigilance, of quiet strength. Life in the Kamakura period had a distinct rhythm for the warrior families who now formed the ruling class of Japan. A typical vassal, called a goknin or honorable retainer of the shogun, held lands in his native province, but was required to spend part of each year in Kamakura serving in the shogunal guard. He came to the eastern capital with a small retinue, took up residence in a modest wooden house, and stood duty at the gates of the shogun's palace. When his period of service ended, he returned home to oversee his estate, collect the rice tax, and settle disputes among his own retainers. His life alternated between the disciplined rhythms of the shogunal court and the quieter rhythms of provincial administration. He raised his sons to be warriors, arranged their marriages carefully to strengthen alliances with neighboring families, and taught them the importance of the 2 great virtues that the age emphasized above all others: Chu, loyalty to one's lord, and Jiri, the obligation to repay debts of duty and gratitude. These virtues formed the foundation of what would slowly, over the coming centuries, be codified as Bushido, the way of the warrior. In the Kamakura period, no formal code yet existed. There were no written manuals of ethics, but the expectations were understood and enforced by custom, by family tradition, by public reputation. A warrior who fled from battle brought shame not only upon himself, but upon his ancestors and his descendants for generations. A warrior who betrayed his lord could expect no shelter in any province. A warrior who fulfilled his duties even unto death was honored in the family shrines and remembered in the tales told around winter hearths. The code was invisible, but it was as binding as iron. At the close of this 4th chapter, the samurai have completed their long ascent from servants to rulers. The first warrior government in the history of Japan sits at Kamakura, presiding over provinces once ruled by aristocrats and monks. Yoritomo, its architect, is at the height of his power, yet the seeds of future difficulty are already planted. Yoritomo's own line will not endure for long. Within a generation of his death in 1199, the Minamoto shoguns will be gone, and a new family will rise to hold power behind the throne of the throne. The Hojo regents will inherit the fruits of Yoritomo's labor, and they will face challenges he could never have imagined. Storms from the sea, ships from the mainland, and upon their decks, warriors of a distant empire riding under a banner unknown to Japan. The Mongols are coming, and the samurai will meet them at the beach. The passing of Minamoto no Yoritomo came not on the battlefield, but from a quiet accident in the winter of 1199. He had ridden out to attend a ceremony marking the opening of a new bridge, and upon his return to Kamakura, he was thrown from his horse. He lingered for some days, gravely injured, and then died at the age of 52. The founder of the shogunate was gone, and with him died a certain iron clarity that had held the young warrior government together. His eldest son, Yori, succeeded him as head of the Minamoto clan and heir to the office of shogun. But Yori was not his father. He was young, hot-tempered, given to reckless hunting and to the company of favorites who were mistrusted by the older warriors. Within 4 years, he had been forced to abdicate by a coalition of Kamakura elders led by his own maternal grandfather, Hojo Tokimasa. 2 years after that, in 1204, Yori was murdered in his bath while confined at a temple in Izu. The younger son of Yoritomo, Sanetomo, was then installed as shogun. He was still a child when he received the title, and real power lay in the hands of Hojo Tokimasa, who took for himself a new office called the Shikken, or regent to the shogun. It was a curious arrangement. Behind the emperor stood the retired emperor. Behind the shogun stood the regent. Layers of authority folded upon themselves, each claiming to serve the one above while, in truth, holding the reins that guided its every movement. Sanetomo grew into a quiet and thoughtful young man, more suited to poetry than to command. He composed verse in the classical style, corresponded with courtiers in Kyoto, and dreamed of building a great ship in which to sail to the mainland of China. The ship was constructed, but it proved too heavy to be launched from the beach and sat rotting on the shore for years, a monument to unrealized longing. Sanetomo's fate was as tragic as his brother's. In the first month of 1219, he traveled to the great shrine of Hachiman in Kamakura to give thanks for a promotion to court rank he had recently received. He climbed the long stone stairway between the ancient cedars, dressed in ceremonial robes, surrounded by his retinue. As he descended the stairway after the ceremony, a hooded figure sprang from behind one of the great trees. It was Kujio, the son of the murdered Yori, who had been raised at the shrine as a monk but had never forgotten his father's fate. With a single swift stroke of a curved sword, he severed Sanetomo's head from his body. The last shogun of the direct Minamoto line lay dead upon the stones, and the assassin fled into the winter darkness. He was hunted down and killed the same night, but the harm was done. The main line of the Minamoto had ended in a spray of blood upon a temple stairway, only 3 generations after its founder. The Hojo family now faced a delicate problem. The shogunate needed a shogun. Without one, the legal fiction that held the whole warrior government together would collapse. Yet no adult male of the Minamoto line survived to claim the office. The regents solved this problem with the same patient political skill that had raised them to power. They invited an infant prince from the Kyujo branch of the Fujiwara family, a boy of 2 years, to come from Kyoto and take the title of shogun. This child, Fujiwara no Yoritsune, became a puppet through whom the Hojo regents ruled. In later generations, they would even bring imperial princes from Kyoto to serve as shoguns. Each new shogun was installed as a boy, kept in a comfortable palace, and gently guided into obedience. If any showed signs of independent ambition, he was quietly removed and replaced. The regents remained. Their names changed, but their office endured. This system, strange as it might seem, worked remarkably well. For nearly a century after Sanetomo's death, the Hojo regents governed with intelligence and moderation. They codified the customs of warrior justice in a document called the Gosubai Shikamoku, promulgated in 1232. This was the first legal code written by warriors for warriors, distinct from the imperial law of the court. It set out rules for inheritance, for the resolution of land disputes, for the punishment of theft and violence, for the responsibilities of vassals to their lords. It was written in plain language, without the elaborate Chinese phrasing of the old imperial edicts, and it became the foundation of warrior law for centuries to come. Under Hojo rule, the shogunate operated with a certain quiet efficiency. Disputes were heard, judgments rendered, taxes collected, and the peace of the realm generally maintained. The warriors who served in Kamakura developed a reputation for austerity and probity. They wore plain hemp robes over their armor, ate simple food of rice and pickled vegetables, and disdained the perfumed extravagances of the Kyoto court. Yet even as the Hojo settled into their quiet dominance, the world beyond the seas of Japan was undergoing a convulsion the likes of which no living soul had witnessed. Far to the west, upon the grasslands of Mongolia, a warlord named Temujin had, in the year 1206, been proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Under his leadership, and that of his sons and grandsons, the Mongols swept across the continent with a speed and savagery that shattered every empire in their path. Northern China fell, Central Asia fell, Persia fell, the steppes of Russia fell. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to the borders of Poland, the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever known. And in 1271, the grandson of Genghis, a man named Kublai Khan, declared himself emperor of a new Chinese dynasty called the Yuan, ruling from a capital he had built at Beijing. Kublai's ambition did not end at the shores of the continent. He had subdued Korea. He looked eastward across the narrow strait to the archipelago of Japan and considered that this island realm, too, should acknowledge his supremacy. Beginning in 1266, he began sending envoys carrying letters demanding that Japan submit as a tributary state. The letters were courteous in their language, but unmistakable in their meaning. Send tribute. Recognize the Yuan emperor. Accept your place within the Mongol world order, or face the consequences. The Kamakura regents, now led by the young Hojo Tokumune, considered these letters with grim silence. Tokumune was in his early 20s when the first envoys arrived, but he possessed the same calm resolution that had marked the best of his family. He consulted with the Shogunal Council, with the retired emperor in Kyoto, with the great warrior families of the western provinces. The decision was unanimous. Japan would not submit. Japan would not even reply. The envoys were sent back without so much as a formal acknowledgement. Kublai sent more envoys. They too were dismissed. Finally, in the fifth attempt, the regents took the extraordinary step of executing the Mongol ambassadors upon their arrival, a violation of the diplomatic customs of every civilized realm. It was a deliberate provocation, a message written in blood. Japan would meet the storm rather than bow beneath it. The first Mongol invasion came in the autumn of 1274. A fleet of some 900 vessels sailed from the ports of Korea, carrying an army of nearly 30,000 men. Most of these were Mongol horsemen, but the force also included large numbers of Chinese and Korean conscripts. The fleet first landed on the small islands of Tsushima and Iki in the strait between Korea and Kyushu. The samurai defenders of these islands, only a few hundred in number, fought bravely but were overwhelmed. Villages were burned, defenders massacred, women and children carried off as captives. Refugees fled to the main island of Kyushu with terrible warnings of what was coming. The main Mongol force landed in Hakata Bay on the northwestern coast of Kyushu in the 10th month of 1274. The samurai of the western provinces had gathered to oppose them, perhaps 6,000 warriors from the great warrior families of Kyushu, led by Shugo and their retainers. The clash on the beaches of Hakata was a shocking experience for the Japanese warriors. For nearly a century, they had fought in the traditional style, with mounted archers riding out to announce their names and lineages, challenging worthy opponents to individual combat. The Mongols fought in a completely different manner. They advanced in disciplined blocks, protected by tightly packed shields. They used gunpowder bombs, primitive explosive weapons hurled from short catapults, which terrified the samurai horses. Their arrows, shorter than Japanese arrows, were often tipped with poison and fired in coordinated volleys rather than aimed at chosen opponents. When a samurai rode out to declare his name, the Mongols simply shot him down without ceremony. The samurai, despite these disadvantages, fought with grim determination throughout the day. They knew every fold of the coast, every path through the pine woods behind the beaches. As night fell, both sides withdrew, the Mongols to their ships offshore, the samurai to their positions inland. And then, in the darkness, the sea rose. A great storm, unusual for that season, swept across the strait. Winds howled through the rigging of the anchored ships. Waves smashed vessel against vessel. By dawn, hundreds of Mongol ships had been destroyed. Thousands of soldiers had drowned. The surviving fleet, battered and broken, hoisted what sails remained and fled back to Korea. The first invasion was over, and though the storm had done what the samurai could not fully accomplish, the warriors of Japan had held the line long enough for the sea itself to save them. The regents did not treat this deliverance as final. They understood that Kublai would come again, and they prepared. Along the shores of Hakata Bay, warriors labored for years to construct a great defensive wall, some 20 kilometers in length, faced with stone and rising to shoulder height. Behind the wall, positions were prepared for archers and lances. Warrior families throughout Kyushu and beyond were placed under permanent obligation to garrison the coast in rotation. Ships were built for coastal patrol. New arrows and new tactics were devised. Above all, the samurai spent 7 long years learning the lessons of the first invasion. They studied Mongol formations, adapted to fighting on foot as well as horseback, and prepared to fight the enemy at the water's edge rather than allow him a foothold inland. The second invasion came in 1281. It was vastly larger than the first. 2 fleets sailed from the continent, one from Korea, the other from southern China. Together, they carried some 140,000 men, an army larger than any that had ever crossed the sea to attack Japan. When these fleets converged on the coast of Kyushu, they found the samurai waiting behind their stone wall. For nearly 2 months, the two forces struggled along the coast. The Mongols could not establish a secure landing. The samurai, unable to drive them fully back to the sea, harassed them constantly, sending small boats out at night to raid the anchored fleet, cutting cables, setting fires, and boarding vessels in swift and bloody actions. And then, in the 7th month of that year, the sea rose again. A great typhoon swept across the strait. For 2 days and 2 nights, the winds howled with a fury that seemed almost divine. The Mongol fleet, anchored in exposed waters, was shattered. Ships were driven ashore and broken upon the rocks. Others sank in deep water, taking their crews with them. When the storm passed, the survivors of the great invasion force struggled to the beaches, only to be cut down by the waiting samurai. Perhaps 100,000 men perished. The invasion was destroyed. At the close of this 5th chapter, the samurai stand upon the beaches of Kyushu with the wreckage of an empire's ambition littering the tideline behind them. They call the great storm Kamikaze, the divine wind, and they see in it proof that the gods themselves have shielded the archipelago from foreign conquest. Yet victory has come at a terrible cost. The Hojo regents have exhausted the treasury preparing for the invasions. The warriors who fought have received little reward, for there are no conquered lands to distribute. Resentment grows quietly in the western provinces. The shogunate that saved Japan from the Mongols will, within 50 years, be undone by the debts and grievances that the very victory created. The victory over the Mongols was celebrated across Japan with prayers of thanksgiving, with offerings at every great shrine, with poems composed in the imperial court, and with quiet feasts held in warrior households from the coasts of Kyushu to the mountains of the north. Yet beneath this celebration, a slow poison was already at work within the Kamakura government. The samurai who had defended the beaches, who had built the great stone wall, who had ridden into the surf to board burning Mongol ships, expected to be rewarded. This was the ancient bargain between lord and vassal. A warrior served, and his lord rewarded him with land, with rice, with new offices. In every previous war, victory had produced conquered territory that could be distributed as prizes. The Genpei War had yielded the estates of the defeated Taira. Every campaign of the past had ended with the winner's men receiving something tangible for their sacrifices. But the Mongol invasions had ended in a defensive victory. The enemy had been driven back into the sea. There were no captured provinces, no seized estates, no confiscated lands. And yet the debts of gratitude were as real as any that had gone before. The Hojo regents did what they could. They granted honorary titles. They redistributed a few small estates that had come into shogunal hands through various means. They arranged marriages between prominent families as a form of political reward. But these gestures fell far short of what the Western warriors believed they had earned. A samurai who had spent 3 campaigns in armor beneath the summer sun, who had lost brothers and cousins on the beaches, who had exhausted his family's stores of rice to feed his retainers during the invasion years, received in the end perhaps a modest promotion in rank and a letter of commendation. He might sell his horse to pay his debts. He might mortgage a piece of his land to a moneylender in Kyoto. He might watch his sons grow up in a household grown suddenly poor. And he would remember, with a bitterness that deepened each year, that his sacrifices had been received in silence. Meanwhile, the Hojo themselves had transformed. The austere warrior regents of the early 13th century, who had lived in modest houses and worn plain hemp robes, had given way to grandchildren and great-grandchildren accustomed to comfort. The main line of the family, called the Tokuso, had accumulated so many governorships, so many stewardships, so many private estates, that they had become in effect the greatest landholders in the country. Their household administration in Kamakura grew increasingly elaborate, and their private retainers, the Mirchibito, came to hold more real power than the older council of senior vassals. Younger branches of the Hojo family, and even the great warrior families that had supported the shogunate from its founding, found themselves excluded from decisions and pushed to the margins. What had once been a genuine council of warriors had narrowed into a private circle around a single powerful clan. Beyond these internal strains, the wider structure of samurai society was changing in ways that pressed hard upon individual families. Warriors of the Kamakura period had traditionally divided their inheritances among all their children. A father with 3 sons might grant a share of his estate to each. Over generations, this practice fragmented holdings into smaller and smaller parcels. A family that had been comfortable in its grandfather's time might find itself, 3 generations later, divided into 6 or 8 small households, each holding only a fraction of the original land. The younger sons in particular struggled. Many turned to moneylenders who had grown wealthy in the great markets of Kyoto and Nara to borrow against their future harvests. Debts mounted. Estates were pledged as collateral. Some families were forced to sell portions of their patrimony to merchants or to Buddhist temples that had grown into major creditors. The old warrior aristocracy was quietly being consumed by the new commercial world. The Hojo regents recognized this crisis and attempted to address it. In 1297, they issued a remarkable decree called the Tokusei Rei, the Virtuous Government Edict. It cancelled the debts of samurai to non-samurai creditors and restored to warrior families lands they had lost through mortgage or forced sale within the previous 20 years. On paper, the edict was an act of generous mercy. In practice, it created chaos. Merchants and moneylenders, having lost their claims overnight, refused to extend further credit to samurai families. Warriors who had temporarily saved their estates now found themselves unable to borrow when the next hard year came. Some judgments of the edict were reversed within a few years. The relief it brought was momentary, and the underlying problems remained. The confidence of ordinary warriors in the Kamakura government continued to erode. While this quiet decay unfolded within the warrior class, the imperial court in Kyoto was undergoing its own transformation. For many decades, the imperial line had been split between 2 branches, descended from 2 brothers who had each held the throne in the middle of the 13th century. These branches were called the Jimyo-in line and the Daikakujai line. The Kamakura shogunate, in an effort to keep the peace between them, had arranged a compromise whereby the 2 branches would alternate on the throne. Each emperor would reign for about 10 years, then abdicate and be succeeded by a member of the other branch. It was a system designed to prevent open conflict between the 2 lines, and it had worked, more or less, for several generations. But it was also a system that created constant political maneuvering, since each branch had strong incentives to secure the succession for its own descendants. In 1318, a new emperor came to the throne from the Daikakujai line. His name was Go-Daigo, and he was unlike any emperor Japan had known in many centuries. He was a scholar, deeply read in Chinese political philosophy, and he believed that the emperor should truly rule. Not reign in ceremonial isolation while shoguns and regents govern the realm, but actually rule, wielding the practical authority that had once belonged to the ancient sovereigns of the 7th century. He was also a man of extraordinary personal energy, willing to gather scholars around him in secret councils, to conspire with warrior monks, to reach out to disaffected samurai in the western provinces. From nearly the moment of his accession, Go-Daigo began to plot the overthrow of the shogunate. His first attempt at rebellion in 1324 was discovered before it could begin. His closest advisors were arrested and executed. Go-Daigo himself, protected by the sanctity of the throne, was allowed to remain as emperor, but under close watch. He was undeterred. In 1331, he tried again. This time he fled the palace with the imperial regalia, taking refuge in a mountain temple at Kasagi in the hills southeast of Kyoto. He called upon warriors loyal to the imperial cause to rise against the shogunate. The response was small at first, but significant. Among those who answered was a warrior named Kusunoki Masashide, a landholder from the mountainous province of Kawachi. Masashide raised his banner in the mountains and began a guerrilla war against Kamakura forces sent to subdue him. He was a master of unconventional tactics, of ambushes and fortified positions in impossible terrain. His small forces held out for months against shogunate armies many times their size. The Kamakura shogunate responded with overwhelming force. Emperor Go-Daigo was captured at Kasagi and exiled to the remote island of Oki in the Sea of Japan. His son and heir was captured shortly afterward. A new emperor from the Jimyo-in line was placed upon the throne. Kusunoki Masashige, however, could not be caught. He melted into the mountains and continued his resistance. And crucially, the shogunate's response revealed something important. To suppress the imperial rebellion, Kamakura had been forced to call upon warriors from every corner of the realm. Many of these warriors, having tasted the excitement of political conflict, having witnessed the difficulty of subduing even one determined enemy, began to consider their own possibilities. Among the warriors dispatched westward against Masashige was a young leader from the Ashikaga family, one of the most powerful branches of the Minamoto line still holding estates in the eastern provinces. His name was Ashikaga Takoji. He was in his late 20s, physically imposing, of thoughtful temperament, and deeply conscious of his own lineage. The Ashikaga traced their descent from the same imperial cadet branch as Yoritomo himself. In their private histories, they remembered themselves as equals of the founder of the shogunate, held down only by circumstance and by Hojo dominance. As Takoji rode westward at the head of his retainers, he considered the state of the realm. He saw a shogunate weakened by financial troubles, by the resentment of unrewarded warriors, by the arrogance of the Tokuso line. He saw an imperial cause that, though presently defeated, retained a powerful moral claim. And he considered his own possibilities with the patient calculation of a man who had studied the career of Yoritomo carefully. In 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo escaped from his island exile with the help of loyal warriors who had come to fetch him. He landed on the mainland and once again called for a general uprising against the shogunate. Warriors began to flock to his banner across the western provinces. Kusunoki Masashige emerged from the mountains to lead his forces in open campaign, and Ashikaga Takoji, sent by the shogunate to crush the rebellion, made his decision. Halfway through his march westward, in the mountains near Kyoto, he raised the imperial banner over his own encampment and declared for Emperor Go-Daigo. The great warriors of the eastern provinces, following his lead, turned their swords against the shogunate that had for so long been their master. The fall of Kamakura came with astonishing speed. As Takoji marched on Kyoto and captured the ancient capital in the name of the emperor, another warrior in the east, Nitta Yoshisada, raised his banner against the shogunate as well. He gathered a growing army of eastern warriors and marched on Kamakura itself. The Hojo defenders, cut off from western support, fought bravely along the narrow mountain passes that guarded the approaches to their city. But the eastern warriors, familiar with every trail and every hidden path, worked their way around the defenses and burst upon the town from unexpected directions. Within days, Kamakura was in flames. The last Hojo regent, Hojo Takatoki, gathered his kinsmen and closest retainers in the Toshijai temple at the eastern edge of the city. There, surrounded by the ancestral grave of his family, he committed ritual suicide together with more than 800 of his followers. The first shogunate, founded by Minamoto no Yoritomo 141 years earlier, was ended. At the close of this sixth chapter, Emperor Go-Daigo returns in triumph to Kyoto. He proclaims the beginning of a new age in which the emperor will rule directly, without the interference of shoguns or regents. He calls this restoration the Kenmu era, and he sets about redistributing offices and rewards among the warriors and courtiers who supported his cause. But his triumph is fragile. The warriors who fought for him did not fight to restore imperial rule as it had existed 6 centuries earlier. They fought for their own advancement, for their own lands, for a share of the offices that had been closed to them under the Hojo. Go-Daigo's dream of pure imperial governance is destined to collide with the ambitions of the very samurai who placed him back upon the throne. And chief among those ambitious samurai stands Ashikaga Takoji, whose banner still flies above the burnt districts of Kyoto, and whose patience, honed over years of quiet observation, is now approaching the moment of its final calculation. The Kenmu Restoration, as Emperor Go-Daigo's brief experiment came to be called, began in the summer of 1333 with the highest of hopes and collapsed within 3 short years beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto in triumph, riding through streets lined with cheering citizens who had grown weary of Hojo rule. He installed himself in the imperial palace, gathered his loyal scholars and courtiers around him, and began at once to distribute rewards and offices to those who had supported his cause. But from the first day of his return, the fundamental problem of his restoration was already visible. The warriors who had brought him to power expected to be rewarded according to warrior custom, with land grants and stewardships and confirmations of their positions in the provincial hierarchy. Go-Daigo, however, dreamed of restoring the imperial system of the 7th and 8th centuries, when nobles at court had ruled directly through appointed officials, without the intermediary of a warrior aristocracy. He wanted the emperor to hold the true reins of government, with warriors serving merely as instruments of imperial will. These two visions could not be reconciled. Go-Daigo began issuing edicts that overturned the customary practices of warrior inheritance. He demanded that every claim to land, every stewardship, every provincial office be personally reviewed and confirmed by his own court. Warriors who had held their estates for generations found themselves required to travel to Kyoto, wait for months for an audience, and present documents in support of claims that under Kamakura had been settled by the shugo of their province. The delays were maddening. The costs were ruinous. Meanwhile, the emperor's favorites, including scholars and courtiers who had never lifted a bow in war, received magnificent grants of land and prestigious offices. Even Kusunoki Masashige, who had defended the imperial cause in the mountains for 2 long years, watched courtiers with no military experience receive rewards greater than his own. Warrior resentment, already smoldering from the years of unrewarded service against the Mongols, now burst into flame. Ashikaga Takoji observed all of this with careful attention. He had been given the honorary title of general and had received extensive lands in the provinces, but his relationship with the emperor was strained from the beginning. Go-Daigo had refused to make him shogun, fearing that the office itself would once again crystallize warrior authority into an independent government. Instead, the emperor granted the title of shogun to his own son, Prince Morinaga, a young man of imperial blood who had spent his youth in warrior monasteries and considered himself a fitting military leader. Prince Morinaga distrusted Takoji from the start and began to plot against him. Takoji, in turn, quietly built his network of eastern retainers, keeping his own counsel, biding his time. In 1335, when a remnant of the Hojo family raised a brief rebellion in the eastern provinces, Takoji requested permission to march east and suppress it. Go-Daigo refused. Takoji marched anyway, defeated the Hojo remnants, and then, once his forces were consolidated in the east, refused to return to Kyoto. He had crossed the threshold. He was in open rebellion against the emperor he had helped restore. What followed was 2 years of brutal warfare across central Japan. Go-Daigo dispatched armies under Nitta Yoshisada and Kusunoki Masashige to crush the Ashikaga rebellion. Takoji's forces were initially defeated and driven all the way to Kyushu, where he took refuge among warrior families who had long been dissatisfied with imperial policies. But once in Kyushu, Takoji rebuilt his forces with astonishing speed. He gathered thousands of new retainers, made alliances with the powerful families of the West, and sailed eastward once more with a great fleet and army. In the 5th month of 1336, his forces met the imperial armies at the Battle of Minetagawa, near what is now Kobe. Kusunoki Masashige, understanding that the battle was hopeless, urged Go-Daigo to withdraw to the mountain fortresses and continue the war from strong defensive positions. The emperor refused. He ordered Masashige to fight on the plain against overwhelming odds. Masashige obeyed. He led his small force into battle knowing he would die. He fought throughout the day, watching his brother and his retainers fall around him. As evening approached, wounded and exhausted, he retreated with his brother to a nearby farmhouse. There, the two brothers faced each other and made their vow. They would be reborn 7 times to serve the imperial cause. Then they killed themselves together. Masashige's loyalty unto death, his willingness to fight a hopeless battle at the emperor's command, would become for centuries afterward the very archetype of the perfect samurai. With Masashige dead and the imperial armies broken, Takoji entered Kyoto in triumph. Go-Daigo fled with a small band of retainers, carrying with him what he claimed were the genuine imperial regalia, and took refuge in the mountains of Yoshino, south of the capital. There he established a rival court, insisting that he remained the true emperor and that any sovereign installed by Takoji was a usurper. Takoji, for his part, placed a different member of the imperial family upon the throne in Kyoto and received from him the appointment as shogun in 1338. Thus began one of the most curious periods in Japanese history, the era of the two courts. For 57 years, from 1336 to 1392, two rival emperors reigned simultaneously in Japan. The northern court sat in Kyoto, backed by the Ashikaga shogunate. The southern court sat in the mountain fastness of Yoshino, backed by loyalist warrior families scattered across the western provinces. Battles were fought sporadically throughout these decades. Neither side could fully destroy the other. The archipelago knew no true peace, and the machinery of warrior loyalty, always fragile, was subjected to constant strain. Ashikaga Takoji himself did not live to see the resolution of this conflict. He died in 1358, exhausted by decades of civil war and by grief over the deaths of his brother and his eldest son. But the shogunate he established, called the Muromachi shogunate after the district of Kyoto, where it built its headquarters, endured. The great achievement of the Ashikaga rulers was the eventual reunification of the two imperial courts in 1392, under the third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. Yoshimitsu, one of the most remarkable figures in samurai history, was a warrior of unusual political sophistication. He negotiated with the southern court, offered generous terms, and persuaded the southern emperor to abdicate in favor of the northern line, on the promise that the two branches would once again alternate upon the throne. That promise was quickly broken by the northern line, but the immediate crisis was ended. Japan was, for a moment, under a single imperial house and a single shogunate. Yoshimitsu's rule marked a curious cultural fusion that would define much of the Muromachi period. Unlike Yoritomo, who had insisted that his warriors remain in Kamakura and avoid the perfumed manners of Kyoto, Yoshimitsu made his headquarters in the ancient capital itself. He built a magnificent villa called Kitayama, upon whose grounds still stands the famous Kinkakuji, the temple of the Golden Pavilion. Its upper floors are covered in gold leaf, its roof crowned with a bronze phoenix, its reflection floating upon a mirror pond surrounded by carefully arranged stones and pines. Yoshimitsu invited the greatest artists, tea masters, and poets of the age to his court. He patronized the development of no theater under the playwrights Kanami and his son Zimi, whose plays combined stately dance, masked performance, and slow chanted verse into an art form unlike anything the world had seen. He opened diplomatic relations with Ming China and accepted, controversially, the title of King of Japan from the Chinese emperor, a title that scandalized traditionalists but reflected his cosmopolitan ambitions. The samurai culture of the Muromachi period thus developed in intimate contact with the refined culture of the Kyoto court. Warrior families increasingly built their residences in the capital or in nearby estates. They studied poetry and calligraphy. They learned the intricate arts of flower arrangement and the appreciation of ceramics. Above all, they embraced the practice of the tea ceremony, which under masters like Murata Juko and later Sen no Rikyu would develop into one of the most refined expressions of Japanese culture. In a small tea room with tatami mats and a hearth, a warrior and his host would prepare and drink powdered green tea in strict silence, appreciating the shape of a rough ceramic bowl, the arrangement of a single flower in an alcove, the sound of water heating in an iron kettle. The tea ceremony taught patience, awareness, humility. It taught that beauty could be found in imperfection, that emptiness itself could be a form of fullness. Warriors who had once measured their honor only in arrows loosed and enemies defeated now added to their vocabulary the words of aesthetic contemplation, of wabi, the quiet dignity of simple things, and of sabai, the beauty that comes with age and weathering. Yet beneath this cultural flowering, The political foundations of the Muromachi shogunate were far weaker than those of the Kamakura had been. The Ashikaga rulers depended upon a network of powerful regional lords called shugo, who administered entire provinces on their behalf. These shugo, over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, gradually accumulated more independent power. They built their own castles, raised their own armies, and administered justice within their provinces with only nominal reference to Kyoto. They also began to intermarry with the great warrior families of the countryside and to consolidate their local retainers into their personal followings. The distinction between a governor appointed by the shogun and a local warlord ruling in his own right began to blur. The name that would emerge to describe these regional powers was daimyo, great name, and by the middle of the 15th century, the daimyo were becoming the true masters of the provinces. The weakness at the center became increasingly clear during the 15th century. The Ashikaga shoguns, one after another, proved less capable than their great predecessor Yoshimitsu. They quarreled with their own brothers over succession. They allowed their retainers to grow rich at the expense of state finances. They became preoccupied with cultural pursuits and gradually abandoned the discipline required to hold the shogunate's diverse coalition together. In 1467, the crisis at the center collapsed into open warfare. A succession dispute within the Ashikaga family became entangled with the rivalries of two great daimyo families, the Hosokawa and the Yamana. Their retainers came to Kyoto to advance their causes, and once there, they turned the ancient capital into a battlefield. The conflict that began in 1467 came to be called the Onin War after the era name of the years in which it began. It lasted 11 years. Kyoto, the sacred capital of 1,000 years, was burned block by block. Temples, palaces, aristocratic mansions, and merchants' warehouses all went up in flames. Priceless works of art were lost. Ancient shrines were reduced to ashes. When the war finally exhausted itself in 1477, no side had truly won. The Ashikaga shogunate survived in name, but its authority beyond the immediate districts of Kyoto had evaporated. The Shugo who had come to fight in the capital returned to their provinces to find that their own retainers had, in their absence, taken control of their territories. Some Shugo could not reclaim their lands. Others found themselves reduced to a shadow of their former power. The old order was breaking apart. At the close of this 7th chapter, Japan enters a new age. The Muromachi shogunate still exists, but its writ runs no further than the streets around its Kyoto palace. Across the archipelago, in every province, warriors are seizing what they can hold. The old distinctions of rank, of imperial charter, of shogunal appointment are fading before a more elemental principle. Whoever holds the land holds the land. Whoever commands the loyalty of retainers commands the province. The name given to this new era is Sengoku, the age of the country at war. For the next 100 years, Japan will be a patchwork of contending domains, of rising warlords, of endless battle. From this chaos, however, will eventually emerge the three great unifiers who will forge the archipelago into a single realm once again. And the samurai, tested as never before, will enter the golden age of their martial history. The Sengoku period, the age of the country at war, unfolded across the Japanese archipelago for more than a century, from the ashes of the Onin War until the coming of the great unifiers late in the 16th century. It was an age of extraordinary violence and equally extraordinary transformation. Every province became a battlefield. Every mountain valley grew a castle. Every warrior family, from the greatest daimyo to the humblest retainer, learned that survival depended upon a hard-eyed calculation of strength, alliance, and the loyalty of one's men. The old bonds of imperial charter and shogunal appointment mattered less and less. In their place rose a new principle called Gekko Kyujo, the low overthrowing the high. Retainers who had once served masters now murdered those masters and took their places. Local warriors of obscure origin rose to command entire provinces. Ancient noble families, unable to adapt to the new realities, were extinguished in a generation or reduced to genteel poverty in the empty palaces of Kyoto. The daimyo who emerged as the true powers of this age were not, for the most part, descendants of the great warrior clans of the Kamakura or Muromachi periods. Some, like the Usugi of Echigo and the Taikta of Kai, could trace their lineages to distinguished ancestors. But many of the most formidable warlords of the Sengoku had risen from obscurity through personal ability, ruthlessness, and skill. The Hojo of Odawara, for instance, who dominated the Kanto plain, were not descended from the ancient Hojo regents at all. Their founder, Hojo Soun, had begun life as a minor retainer of no particular distinction, and had, through a combination of tactical brilliance and political cunning, seized a small castle in the province of Izu and built from it, over a lifetime of patient campaigning, one of the greatest domains in eastern Japan. Similar stories played out across the archipelago. The Mori family, who came to dominate the western provinces, rose from a modest position through the extraordinary strategic gifts of Mori Motonari. The Chosokabe of Shikoku, the Shimazu of Satsuma, the Date of Mutsu, all built their power in their own ways during this century of war. Life within a daimyo domain during the Sengoku period developed its own distinctive character. Each domain became, in effect, a small state with its own laws, its own economy, and its own military establishment. The daimyo governed from a castle, often perched upon a hilltop or built at the junction of important rivers and roads. Round the castle grew a town, called a jokomachi, or castle town, where samurai retainers lived in disciplined blocks of houses, where merchants set up shops to serve the warrior population, and where artisans produced the weapons, armor, and other goods required by the domain. The daimyo issued laws called bunko kuho, domain laws, which regulated everything from the inheritance of samurai estates to the settling of disputes between merchants. These laws often bore the personal stamp of the daimyo who wrote them, reflecting his particular concerns and prejudices. The great daimyo Taikta Shinjin, for example, issued a famous law code that emphasized the importance of maintaining the loyalty of retainers, the proper conduct of military campaigns, and the strict punishment of those who insulted the authority of the domain. The samurai retainers who served these daimyo lived under discipline that was more rigorous than anything their Kamakura ancestors had known. They were expected to be ready for war at any moment. They trained daily in the martial arts, in horseback riding, in the use of the sword, the bow, and increasingly the spear. Long polearms called yari became the standard weapon of the battlefield, replacing the older emphasis on the bow. Massed formations of spear-armed foot soldiers, called ashigaru or light-footed men, became the backbone of Sengoku armies. These ashigaru were often peasants recruited from the countryside, given a modest wage and rudimentary training, and organized into disciplined blocks that could break the charge of even the finest cavalry. War itself had been transformed from the ritual individual combat of earlier ages into a matter of tactical formations, coordinated movement, and the massed application of force. Into this transformed world came, in the middle of the 16th century, a new element that would change the balance of every battlefield. In 1543, a Portuguese trading ship, blown off course by a storm, was cast upon the shores of the small island of Tengashima, south of Kyushu. Among the goods the Portuguese carried were matchlock arquebuses, primitive firearms that fired a lead ball propelled by burning gunpowder. The local lord, Tengashima Tokitaka, purchased 2 of these weapons at enormous expense and immediately set his best swordsmith to work reproducing them. Within a decade, Japanese blacksmiths across the archipelago were producing arquebuses of remarkable quality. The weapons spread rapidly. Every ambitious daimyo recognized that firearms could revolutionize the battlefield. The samurai of the Sengoku, far from disdaining these foreign devices as beneath their honor, embraced them with enthusiasm. Guns, they understood, could kill a man at a distance. Guns did not care about the noble lineage of the man who fired them or the man who fell. Guns were simply effective, and effectiveness was what the age demanded. The arrival of firearms coincided with the arrival of European missionaries. The first of these was Francis Xavier, a Jesuit priest from the Kingdom of Navarre who landed at Kagoshima in 1549. He and his fellow missionaries began preaching a new religion, Christianity, that they had brought from a distant land. Some daimyo welcomed the missionaries, partly out of genuine spiritual curiosity, partly because Christian conversion opened lucrative trade relations with the Portuguese ships that carried Chinese silk to Japanese ports. Certain domains in Kyushu, particularly those of the Otomo, the Arima, and the Omura families, became centers of Japanese Christianity. Their daimyo converted publicly, encouraged their retainers to follow, and permitted the construction of churches within their castle towns. By the end of the 16th century, perhaps 300,000 Japanese had embraced the new faith. The samurai class was represented substantially among these converts, and Christian samurai fought in battles carrying rosaries alongside their prayer beads, wearing crosses over their armor. It was an unexpected chapter in the long history of the warrior class, and it would end, as we shall see, in tragedy. Amid the ceaseless warfare of the Sengoku period, three great warlords emerged whose careers would eventually bring the age to an end and reunify the archipelago under a single power. The first of these was Oda Nobunaga, born in 1534 as the heir to a relatively minor daimyo family in the province of Ohiri. Nobunaga was a man of extraordinary energy and disturbing brilliance. In his youth, he was considered so eccentric that his own retainers doubted his fitness to rule. He dressed shabbily, associated with common townsmen, and displayed a rebellious contempt for the customary courtesies of his class. Yet from the moment he became head of his family in 1551, he demonstrated a capacity for strategic thinking and organizational innovation unlike anything his rivals possessed. He unified his home province through swift military campaigns. In 1560, at the Battle of Okezama, he defeated a vastly larger invading army under the daimyo Imagawa Yoshimoto, killing Yoshimoto himself in a surprise attack during a rainstorm. The victory made his reputation across the archipelago. Within a decade, he was the most feared warlord in central Japan. Nobunaga was among the first daimyo to grasp fully the implications of firearms and to organize his armies around them. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he used 3,000 arquebusiers, rotating in ranks to maintain a continuous rate of fire, to devastate the famous cavalry of Taikta Katsuyori. The Taikta horsemen, considered the finest in Japan, charged the Oda positions again and again through the day, and again they were shot down before they could reach the wooden palisades that protected Nobunaga's gunners. By evening, the Taikta army was destroyed, and one of the greatest warrior families of the age was broken beyond recovery. The battle marked, in a sense, the end of the old age of mounted samurai warfare. From that day forward, no daimyo could afford to neglect firearms, and the massed use of guns became the decisive factor in every major engagement. Nobunaga did not stop at military innovation. He recognized that the political fragmentation of Japan could be ended only by ruthless action against every entrenched power that stood in the way of unification. He marched on Kyoto in 1568, installed a puppet shogun of the Ashikaga line, and used him to legitimize his own authority. When that puppet, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, attempted to intrigue against him, Nobunaga simply drove him out of the capital in 1573, ending the Muromachi shogunate that had endured for more than 2 centuries. He also turned his attention to the great Buddhist military institutions that had, for centuries, wielded independent political and military power. In 1571, he ordered the destruction of the great Tendai monastery on Mount Hiei, which had stood since the 9th century as a center of learning and as a fortress of warrior monks. His troops burned the temples, killed the monks, and left the mountain a smoking wasteland. Similar campaigns followed against other Buddhist military strongholds, most notably against the Ikwiki, a network of fanatical Pure Land sects that had, in some provinces, effectively displaced local daimyo rule. Nobunaga fought these Ikwiki for a decade, before finally reducing their great fortress temple at Ishiyama Honganji in 1580. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled about a third of the archipelago and was poised to complete the unification of Japan. His most trusted generals were pressing campaigns against the great remaining rivals, the Mori of the west and the Usugi of the north. And then, on a summer morning in the 6th month of that year, the story took a sudden and shocking turn. Nobunaga was resting at a small temple called Honojai in Kyoto, accompanied by only a small guard of attendants. He was preparing to march west to join a campaign against the Mori. In the darkness before dawn, his trusted general Eichai Mitsuhide, whom he had sent to reinforce that same campaign, turned his army instead upon Kyoto. Mitsuhide's forces surrounded the temple. Whether the motive was old personal grievance, political calculation, or genuine belief that Nobunaga had grown dangerously tyrannical, historians still debate. What is certain is that as the first light of dawn touched the roof tiles of the temple, Mitsuhide's soldiers set the buildings on fire. Nobunaga fought briefly with a spear, was wounded, and then withdrew into an inner chamber where he committed suicide as the flames closed around him. His body was consumed. Not a fragment was ever found. The first of the three great unifiers was gone, cut down at the very moment his work seemed nearest to completion. At the close of this 8th chapter, the archipelago holds its breath. Eichai Mitsuhide, master of Kyoto and holding the imperial capital, waits to see whether his coup will succeed. Nobunaga's other generals are scattered across the country, engaged in distant campaigns. Yet one of these generals, a man of extraordinary ability who had risen from the humblest possible origins, is already turning his forces around and marching back toward the capital at a speed no one believed possible. His name is Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he will become the second of the great unifiers. He will avenge Nobunaga, complete the conquest of Japan, and rise to a position of power such as no man of common birth had ever held. And behind him, watching patiently, another warrior waits his own turn. His name is Tokugawa Ieyasu, and his patience, when it finally reaches its moment, will change the history of Japan for 265 years. The news of Nobunaga's death at Honojai reached Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the west, where he was besieging the castle of Takamatsu against the forces of the Mori clan. Hideyoshi had risen from origins so humble that his early years remain half buried in legend. Some accounts say his father was a peasant farmer. Others say he was a low-ranking foot soldier who fell in battle when his son was still a small child. What is certain is that Hideyoshi entered Nobunaga's service as an ashigaru, a common foot soldier, sometime in the 1550s, and through nothing but his own extraordinary intelligence and force of will had risen to become one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals. He was small in stature, with a face said to resemble that of a monkey, and he was gifted with a personal charm that could disarm the coldest suspicion. He was also a strategic genius of the first order. Hideyoshi received the news of his master's death and understood at once what must be done. Within hours, he had opened secret negotiations with the Mori leaders, concluding a hasty peace that allowed him to withdraw his army eastward. He did not tell the Mori that Nobunaga was dead. He simply offered terms so generous that they could not refuse, then turned his forces around and marched back toward Kyoto with a speed that has since become legendary. His army covered more than 200 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, marching through summer heat and heavy rain, sleeping only briefly, driving forward with an urgency that surprised even his own officers. At the Battle of Yamazaki, at the base of the mountains south of Kyoto, Hideyoshi's forces confronted the army of Eichai Mitsuhide. Mitsuhide, whose coup had been supported by fewer allies than he had expected, was crushed. He fled the battlefield with a small band of survivors and was killed a few nights later by peasant bandits who did not even know they were killing a great warlord. With Mitsuhide dead and Nobunaga avenged, Hideyoshi maneuvered through the treacherous politics of Nobunaga's remaining generals with the same skill he had brought to the battlefield. He allied with some, defeated others, and within 3 years had established himself as the effective master of Nobunaga's domains. He then continued the work of unification with the same relentless energy. In 1583, he defeated his last major internal rival at the Battle of Shizugatake. In 1585, he completed the conquest of Shikoku. In 1587, his massive army descended upon Kyushu and subdued the great southern daimyo. In 1590, he besieged the vast Hojo castle of Odawara in the eastern Kanto plain and reduced it after a siege of several months. With the fall of Odawara, the archipelago was for the first time in more than a century united under a single power. Hideyoshi had accomplished what Nobunaga had begun, and he had done so in less than a decade. Yet Hideyoshi faced a problem that his master had never confronted. He was not of noble birth. The office of shogun, which by ancient custom had to be granted to a descendant of the Minamoto line, could not be conferred upon him. He solved this problem in his characteristic way, through a combination of political creativity and unabashed manipulation of the imperial court. He arranged to be adopted, at least formally, into the ancient Fujiwara family, and he received from the imperial court the equally ancient civilian office of Kanpaku, or regent. He then used this office to rule the archipelago in a manner more absolute than any shogun before him. He required every daimyo to swear personal oaths of loyalty to him and to hand over hostages, usually wives and children, to reside in his capital as guarantees of good behavior. He conducted vast land surveys throughout the country, called the Teiko Kenchai, which registered every rice field, measured its productivity, and determined the tax obligations of every domain. He also issued in 1588 the famous Sword Hunt Edict, ordering all weapons in the possession of peasants and priests to be surrendered. Only samurai would henceforth be permitted to carry the two swords, the long katana and the short wakizashi, that had become the marks of their class. This edict marked a formal division that would define Japanese society for the next 3 centuries. Before Hideyoshi, the line between samurai and peasant had been permeable. Provincial warriors often farmed their own land, and peasants who distinguished themselves in local militias could sometimes rise into the warrior class. After Hideyoshi's edict, the two classes were legally separated. A samurai was a hereditary warrior, resident in his lord's castle town, forbidden to engage in agriculture or commerce. A peasant was a hereditary farmer, tied to his village, forbidden to bear arms. This rigid social structure would be inherited and further codified by the Tokugawa regime that followed Hideyoshi. The transformation of the samurai from active warrior to hereditary bureaucrat would take another generation, but its foundations were laid by the sword hunt of 1588. Hideyoshi's ambition, however, was not satisfied by the mere unification of Japan. In the final years of his rule, he conceived a plan of extraordinary and, in retrospect, disastrous grandeur. He would invade Korea, use it as a staging ground for the conquest of Ming China, and establish himself as the master of an empire spanning all of East Asia. In 1592, he launched a massive invasion force across the strait to Korea. Some 160,000 samurai and ashigaru landed on the Korean peninsula and drove north with astonishing speed. They captured Seoul within weeks and Pyongyang within months. But the Koreans, aided by their extraordinary admiral Yi Sun-sin and by massive Chinese armies sent by the Ming Emperor, gradually turned the tide. Yi Sun-sin's ironclad turtle ships devastated Japanese supply fleets. Chinese armies pushed the Japanese back down the peninsula. The war dragged on for years, resumed in 1597 after a brief truce, and finally ended in 1598 with Hideyoshi's death and the withdrawal of the exhausted Japanese armies. Nothing had been gained. Tens of thousands of samurai had died in a foreign land far from home. The treasury had been drained. The great daimyo who had contributed troops to the invasion returned with weakened forces and grievances against the Toyotomi regime. Hideyoshi's own death in 1598 came at the worst possible moment. He left as his heir a small child, Toyotomi Hideyori, only 5 years old. He also left a council of 5 great daimyo, the Gotero, who were meant to govern the country until Hideyori came of age. Among these 5 was the man who had been quietly observing everything for decades, waiting with a patience that no rival could match. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu had been born in 1543, the same year that Portuguese firearms first reached Japan. His childhood had been one of extraordinary hardship. His family, the Matsudera, were minor lords caught between 2 more powerful daimyo, and as a boy, Ieyasu had been sent as a hostage first to one, and then to another of these greater warlords, spending his formative years in captivity. He learned in those years the arts of patience, of watching, of waiting for the moment when action would truly matter. When he came of age, he allied with Oda Nobunaga and served him faithfully. After Nobunaga's death, he made his peace with Hideyoshi and served him too, expanding his own domain in the eastern provinces. When Hideyoshi ordered him to relocate his headquarters from the ancestral lands of Mikawa to the swampy Kanto plain around the small fishing village of Edo, Ieyasu accepted without complaint. Over the following years, he transformed Edo into a great city, drained the marshes, built canals and warehouses, established a castle of impressive scale, and quietly assembled the greatest single domain in Japan. When Hideyoshi died, and the young Hideyori was left in his uncertain regency, Ieyasu began to move. He made alliances with sympathetic daimyo, particularly with those from the eastern provinces who resented the influence of Hideyoshi's Osaka-based officials. He arranged marriages between his own children and the children of key allies. He extended his authority through carefully calibrated favors and threats. Opposition to his growing power crystallized around Ishida Mitsunari, one of Hideyoshi's most trusted administrators, who saw clearly that Ieyasu intended to displace the Toyotomi heir. In the ninth month of the year 1600, the two factions met at last in battle. The field was called Sekigahara, a valley in central Japan where the great highway between Kyoto and the east passed between wooded hills. The Battle of Sekigahara, fought on the 21st day of the 10th month of 1600, was one of the largest battles ever fought on Japanese soil and the most consequential in the history of the samurai class. Some 160,000 warriors gathered upon the field, arranged in two great armies. Ieyasu's eastern army faced Mitsunari's western army across a broad expanse of rice fields and low ridges. The morning began with a heavy autumn fog that limited visibility and delayed the initial contact. When the fog burned off, the two armies engaged with fierce intensity. Neither side gained a clear advantage during the morning hours. The outcome of the battle, and thus of Japanese history for the next 2.5 centuries, depended upon the decision of a single man. Kobayakawa Hidaki, a young daimyo whose forces held a critical position on Mount Matsuo overlooking the battlefield, had been placed nominally on the side of Mitsunari, but had secretly negotiated with Ieyasu before the battle. As the fighting reached its peak, Kobayakawa's men remained still, watching. Ieyasu, growing impatient, ordered his gunners to fire a volley at Kobayakawa's positions to force a decision. Kobayakawa then moved. His forces charged down the mountain, but not against Ieyasu. They fell instead upon their supposed allies, the western troops of Otani Yoshitsugu, who held the position at the base of the mountain. The betrayal broke the western army. Otani's forces, attacked from an unexpected direction, collapsed. Other units of the western army, seeing their comrades destroyed, broke and fled. Within a few hours, the battle was over. Ishida Mitsunari escaped the field, but was captured a few days later and executed. Other leaders of the western faction were either killed in battle, forced to commit suicide, or stripped of their domains. Ieyasu, master of the field, was master also of Japan. At the close of this ninth chapter, Tokugawa Ieyasu stands at the summit of a country he has spent his entire life preparing to rule. In 1603, 3 years after Sekigahara, the imperial court grants him the title of shogun. He establishes his capital at Edo, the city he has built from marshland into a great metropolis. He begins immediately to construct a system of government designed to endure. Every daimyo is required to live in Edo for alternating years, leaving family members behind as hostages when he returns to his domain. The Toyotomi heir Hideyori, still barricaded in the great castle of Osaka, will be destroyed in a final siege in 1615, ending forever any possibility of counterclaim. Christianity, which has spread widely through Kyushu and beyond, will be systematically suppressed, its Japanese followers driven underground or martyred, its foreign missionaries expelled or executed. Trade with foreign nations will be reduced to a single tightly controlled port at Nagasaki. Japan will close its doors to the wider world and turn inward, entering an age of peace, unlike anything the samurai have ever known. And within that peace, the warrior class itself will be transformed once more, from active soldiers into hereditary administrators, poets, philosophers, and finally into a class whose skills at war become memories preserved in ceremony and story. The Tokugawa peace that settled upon Japan after 1615 was unlike any peace the archipelago had known in 1,000 years. The great sieges were over. The last castle of Toyotomi loyalists at Osaka had fallen in a summer of terrible fire, and the young Hideyori had taken his own life amid the burning towers. Ieyasu himself died the following year, in 1616, having lived long enough to see his work truly completed. His son Hidetada and his grandson Imitsu inherited a system of government so carefully constructed that it would endure for 2.5 centuries with only minor adjustments. The great daimyo, once masters of independent domains, were bound to Edo by the Sankinkotai system of alternate attendance. Every daimyo was required to spend alternate years in residence at Edo, leaving his wife and heir behind as permanent hostages when he returned to his own province. The financial burden of maintaining two residences, of traveling between them with a retinue befitting his rank, of contributing to public works projects in the capital, drained the treasuries of even the wealthiest domains. A daimyo who might otherwise have entertained thoughts of rebellion found himself instead calculating how to pay his retainers through the coming winter. For the samurai class beneath the daimyo, the transformation was equally profound. Peace had made them, in a sense, obsolete. There were no more battles to fight, no more castles to besiege, no more provinces to conquer. Yet the class itself remained legally defined, hereditarily fixed, and privileged with the right to bear the two swords and to receive stipends of rice from their lords. What, then, was a samurai to do in a time of peace? The Tokugawa answer was clear. He became an administrator. He became a bureaucrat. He served in the domain government of his lord, writing reports, keeping accounts, managing rice storehouses, adjudicating disputes between peasants, overseeing public works. He became a scholar. Confucian learning, once a marginal pursuit of the warrior class, now became central to samurai education. Schools of Confucianism flourished in every domain, teaching the ancient classics of China alongside the histories of Japan. A samurai was expected to know the writings of Zhu Zai, to compose verse in Chinese as well as Japanese, to understand the principles of filial piety and loyalty as expounded by the sages of antiquity. Yet the samurai were not permitted to forget entirely that they were warriors. They still trained with the sword. They still learned archery and horsemanship and the ceremonial forms of martial arts that had been developed by their ancestors. They still wore the two swords at their sides, the long katana and the short wakizashi, as marks of their class. And they were still expected to conduct themselves according to a code of honor that had, over the centuries of war, been slowly refined into something like a formal ethical system. It was during the early Tokugawa period that this code came at last to be given a name, Bushido, the way of the warrior. The great expositions of Bushido appeared in the 17th century in the writings of scholars like Yamaga Soko and the samurai retainer Yamamoto Tsunetomo. Tsunetomo's dictated reflections, gathered into a book called the Hagakure, or Hidden Leaves, opened with a famous declaration. The way of the warrior, he wrote, is found in death. A samurai who wished to serve his lord truly must accept that death might come at any moment and must therefore conduct every action, every conversation, every gesture, as though he were already prepared to lay down his life. The Hagakure and similar writings expressed an ideal that was, in many ways, becoming purely theoretical. The samurai who read these books served in peacetime administrations. They rarely drew their swords except in ceremonial practice. Their duties involved documents, calculations, and the polite management of subordinates. And yet the ideal of the warrior who lived always in the shadow of death gave meaning to a class that might otherwise have felt its purpose slipping away. It provided a framework of dignity and discipline that shaped their daily lives. A samurai bowed correctly to his superiors, treated his equals with formal courtesy, disciplined his subordinates with firm restraint. He rose before dawn, practiced with his sword in the cold morning air, studied his lessons through the day, and retired at night, having accounted carefully for every hour. He raised his sons to do the same. He arranged their marriages within the samurai class, forbade them to associate with merchants or actors, and prepared them to inherit his stipend, his rank, and his ancestral swords. A famous incident from the early 18th century captured the tension between the Bushido ideal and the realities of peace. In the year 1701, a young daimyo named Asano Naganori, lord of the small domain of Arko, was performing ceremonial duties at Edo Castle when he was insulted and humiliated by an older court official named Kira Yoshinaka. In the heat of that humiliation, Asano drew his sword and attacked Kira within the castle precincts. He inflicted only a minor wound before he was restrained, but the offense against Tokugawa law was grave. Drawing a weapon inside the shogun's castle was forbidden absolutely. Asano was ordered to commit ritual suicide that same day. His domain was confiscated. His retainers, some 300 samurai who had served his family loyally, became ronin, masterless men with no lord and no stipend. 47 of these ronin, led by their senior retainer Oishi Yoshio, refused to accept the disgrace of their lord's death without response. They spent nearly 2 years in patient preparation. Oishi went to Kyoto and pretended to descend into drunkenness and dissolution to allay the suspicions of Kira's spies. Others took low employment in Edo, gathering information about Kira's residence and his household schedule. On a snowy winter night in the 12th month of 1702, they gathered together and struck. They forced their way into Kira's mansion in Edo, fought through his guards, and found the old man hiding in a charcoal shed. They cut off his head and carried it in solemn procession through the snowy streets of Edo to the temple of Sengaku-ji, where they laid it upon the grave of their late lord. Their vengeance completed, they surrendered themselves to the authorities and awaited judgment. The case posed an agonizing dilemma for the Tokugawa government. On the one hand, the 47 had committed murder and had done so in defiance of the shogun's peace. On the other hand, they had acted in perfect accordance with the traditional warrior code of loyalty to their lord. Ordinary citizens across Edo celebrated them as heroes. Scholars debated the case in books and pamphlets. In the end, the shogunate reached a compromise verdict. The 47 were condemned to death, but they were granted the honor of committing ritual suicide as samurai rather than being executed as common criminals. All 47 died together in the early months of 1703. They were buried alongside their lord at Sengaku-ji, where their grave remained to this day. Their story, told and retold in plays, novels, and eventually films, became perhaps the most beloved single narrative of the samurai age. It expressed both the beauty and the tragedy of the warrior code. Loyalty absolute unto death, but purchased at the price of 47 lives that might otherwise have served their families and their communities for many years to come. Beyond such dramatic episodes, the long Tokugawa peace also brought extraordinary cultural achievement. Freed from the demands of war, samurai and townsmen alike turned their attention to art, literature, and refined entertainment. The great cities of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto grew into centers of an urban culture unlike anything the archipelago had seen. Kabuki theater emerged, with its elaborate costumes, stylized acting, and dramatic tales of loyalty, love, and vengeance. Woodblock printing developed into a sophisticated visual art, producing images of famous actors, beautiful courtesans, landscape scenes, and eventually, in the works of masters like Hokusai and Hiroshige, some of the most influential visual art the world would ever see. Haiku poetry reached its highest development in the 17-syllable meditations of Matsuo Basho, who walked the roads of northern Japan in the late 17th century, composing verses about the moon over pine trees, the sound of a frog jumping into an old pond, the sudden fall of a summer shower. Novels appeared, most famously the works of Ihara Seikaku, telling stories of merchants and courtesans and the pleasure quarters of the great cities. A wealthy merchant culture developed alongside the samurai class, and the boundaries between them, though still legally rigid, grew increasingly porous in practice. Merchants funded the arts. Samurai took second jobs as scholars or teachers to supplement their fixed rice stipends, which lost purchasing power as the economy changed around them. By the middle of the 19th century, the samurai class had drifted far from its origins. Most samurai had never drawn a sword in earnest. Many were quite poor, dependent on ever-shrinking stipends, and increasingly in debt to the merchants they were supposed to look down upon. The Tokugawa system, so brilliantly constructed to preserve peace, had grown ossified and unable to respond to new challenges. And in 1853, the first of those new challenges arrived in the form of 4 black ships sailing into Edo Bay under the command of the American Commodore Matthew Perry. Perry demanded that Japan open itself to foreign trade after more than 2 centuries of isolation. The shogunate, unable to resist, signed treaties that lower-ranking samurai regarded as humiliating capitulations. Discontent boiled up rapidly. Younger samurai from the western domains, particularly Satsuma and Choshu, began to plot the overthrow of the shogunate and the restoration of direct imperial rule. They rallied under the slogan Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The final crisis came with astonishing speed. Between 1866 and 1868, a coalition of samurai from the western domains defeated the shogunate's armies. In early 1868, the young Emperor Meiji issued a proclamation restoring imperial rule. The last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, surrendered his authority and retired to private life. The new imperial government moved the capital from Kyoto to Edo, renaming the city Tokyo. And then, in one of the most extraordinary acts of political self-sacrifice in world history, the samurai themselves dismantled their own class. Between 1869 and 1876, the new Meiji government abolished the domains, ended the hereditary stipends, prohibited the wearing of swords by any but active-duty soldiers and police, and eliminated the legal distinction between samurai and commoner. Many former samurai adapted to the new order, entering the modern civil service, joining the imperial army and navy, becoming teachers, doctors, engineers, and entrepreneurs. Some resisted violently, most notably in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, when the great samurai Seigo Takamori led 30,000 traditional warriors in a doomed uprising against the modern conscript army of the imperial government. Seigo's men fought bravely and died in the mountains of Kyushu, victims of rifles and artillery wielded by peasants trained in the Western manner. Seigo himself, wounded and unable to continue, was helped to a quiet spot by a loyal retainer and committed his final act of suicide in the fashion of his ancestors. With his death, the last great samurai uprising was finished. The class that had ruled Japan for 7 centuries dissolved into the modern nation. At the close of this 1,000-year journey, we stand in a Japan transformed beyond recognition from the world of Sakanao no Tamuramaro and the frontier warriors of the Heian court. The samurai as a legal class are gone, their swords surrendered, their stipends ended, their castles converted into public parks or historical monuments. Yet their memory endures. Their code, their aesthetic, their tales of loyalty and sacrifice remain woven into the fabric of Japanese culture. In the quiet halls of tea ceremony practitioners, in the training grounds of kendo and iaido schools, in the images of Kurosawa's films and the pages of countless novels and manga, the samurai continue to live. They have become something like eternal figures of the Japanese imagination, representing virtues that transcend any particular age. Discipline, loyalty, the willingness to sacrifice self for something greater than self. The capacity to find beauty in impermanence, dignity in restraint, meaning in the shadow of death. And so our journey ends where it began, in stillness. 1,000 years have passed before us tonight, from the horsemen of the Emishi frontier to the last defenders of the Satsuma Mountains. Emperors rose and fell. Shogunates were founded and destroyed. Warriors served and betrayed, loved and killed, prayed and wrote poems, built castles and watched them burn. The great river of history flowed onward through all of it, carrying everything it touched into memory. As you rest tonight, let their story settle gently into the quiet places of your mind. The samurai are gone, but they are also here, present in every quiet act of discipline and every remembered vow of loyalty. Let their long journey draw to its close within you as well. Let the flames of Honojai fade to embers. Let the snow settle upon the grave at Sengakujai. Let the last horseman of a lost age ride slowly into the mountain mist and disappear. May you find in the ancient rhythms of their story the peace they themselves so often sought and so rarely found. Sleep now quietly, and let the centuries pass gently into dreams.